Hello. I want to talk to you a little bit today about Indigenous research ethics. I need to make it clear at the very start that I'm not an expert on Indigenous research ethics. For that, you need an Indigenous researcher. I'm a student of Indigenous research ethics and methods, and I will always only be a student because I'm not an Indigenous person. And by the Indigenous here, I mean a native person of a colonised, settled land that's been colonised by other people. The word Indigenous is used in different ways, but that's the way I'm using it here. I find Indigenous research absolutely fascinating. It's very different from Euro-Western research. It predates Euro-Western research by tens of thousands of years. It's a standalone paradigm, and it's fascinating to study. In my book on research ethics, I set the Indigenous research paradigm side by side with the Euro-Western research paradigm, not to try to assess which is better, because that's a pointless question, but to look at what Euro-Western researchers can learn from Indigenous research. What we can't do is cherry-pick Indigenous methods like we cherry-pick Euro-Western methods, because Indigenous methods are embedded in Indigenous communities and contexts. But we can learn a lot, I think, from Indigenous researchers' approaches to ethics. There are slight variations in these around the world, but from what I can gather from the literature I've read to date, there seems to be a fairly consistent use of 4 specific principles. And I think we can learn such a lot from these in the Euro-Western paradigm. The first principle is relational accountability. That's 2 quite long and complicated words. Indigenous researchers, Indigenous people, as I understand it, regard themselves as being in relationship not only with each other, but also with the land, with animals, with the environment, with ancestors, with the cosmos, with ideas and dreams. It's a very broad definition of relationship. Varies a bit between different Indigenous peoples, as I understand it, but essentially it's a quite holistic approach to relationship. So relational accountability means, as a researcher, being accountable not only to other people, but also to the land, the animals, the cosmos, the ancestors, and so on. And this is a really interesting thing to think about, because if we tried to apply that approach to Euro-Western research, it would change it quite dramatically, I think. Then the second principle is that knowledge is communal. Knowledge belongs to everyone. This is again very different from the Euro-Western approach, where we regard knowledge as belonging to individuals, individual people or corporations, and we have laws that enshrine that, talk about intellectual property. My books are my intellectual property. If anyone passes off my writing as their own, I can sue them and probably win a court case and lots of money and stuff like that, if I could be bothered. But for Indigenous peoples, knowledge belongs to everyone. And again, this is a really interesting thing for us to think about and consider maybe learning from. I'm not suggesting we can adopt these principles wholesale in Euro-Western research, but I think we can learn a lot from considering them. The third one is reciprocity. And this means that I give you something, you give me something. That's too simple, really. It's not that simple, but that's the basis of it as I understand it. So a research interview will be much more like a conversation. If you visit someone at their home or their workplace to talk to them about your research, you might bring a gift to acknowledge that the time that and the opportunity that they're offering to you. I believe it doesn't have to be necessarily all equal and calculated, but there are social understandings of how reciprocity works in different Indigenous communities. And certainly if I was ever going to spend time with people in an Indigenous community, I would be wanting to find out what the social customs were and how I could fulfill those social obligations in an appropriate way. And research isn't different from society in Indigenous research. It's very much part of society. It's not a separate thing. The fourth key principle is mutual benefit. And this is perhaps the one that's been most badly abused by Euro-Western researchers taking information from Indigenous people and using it to benefit their own careers or their own profits. without taking anything back to the Indigenous communities where the research was done. The principle is that everyone should benefit from research, not only the researcher, but also anyone who's taken part. What benefit means will vary in different contexts, different settings, different research projects, but the principle is solid and needs to be acknowledged and worked with. So those are some interesting ideas that I think really everyone doing research in the Euro-Western world needs to consider and reflect on for the benefit of our own research and our own participants, to see if we can become rather more ethical in the way that we do research.